It began as an ordinary morning at Veterans Memorial Hospital in downtown Portland, where retired Air Force Colonel James Hawk Harrison sat quietly in the waiting room, never expecting that his peaceful visit would turn into a tense standoff with a group of outlaw bikers who were about to learn a hard lesson about respecting veterans. Before we dive into the story, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications to see more inspiring stories about veterans standing up for what's right. Drop a salute in the comments if you believe in respecting our veterans. Your support helps us share these important stories with the world. Early autumn sunlight filtered through the large windows, casting a warm glow across the room filled with veterans of different ages and service branches. Colonel Harrison, known simply as Hawk to his fellow veterans, sat in his usual spot near the window, his steel gray hair and sharp blue eyes reflecting his 30 years of distinguished Air Force service. At 62, he carried himself with the same quiet dignity that had earned him respect during his years commanding special operations units. His weekly visits to the VA had become a routine, not just for his own checkups, but to mentor younger veterans struggling with their transition to civilian life. Nancy Chen, the head nurse who had worked at the VA for over 2 decades, smiled warmly as she passed by his seat. "Good morning, Colonel. Here early as usual?" she asked, clutching her tablet. Hawk nodded, returning her smile. "You know me, Nancy. Early is on time and on time is late." The waiting room was filling up with its regular morning crowd. There was Mike Thompson, a young Army veteran still adjusting to his prosthetic leg, and Sarah Martinez, a retired Navy corpsman who volunteered at the VA's PTSD support group. They were all part of an unspoken community, bound together by their service and shared experiences. The peaceful atmosphere was shattered by the thunderous roar of motorcycles pulling into the parking lot. Through the windows, Hawk watched as 5 riders dismounted their bikes, their leather jackets emblazoned with the emblem of the Devil's Outcasts, a notorious biker gang known for causing trouble across the Pacific Northwest. At the head of the group was a tall, muscular man with a shaved head and a thick beard, who would later be known as Razor. His face was set in a permanent sneer as he pushed through the entrance doors, followed by his crew. The temperature in the waiting room seemed to drop several degrees as conversations died and veterans straightened in their seats. Nancy Chen stepped forward, maintaining her professional demeanor. "Can I help you, gentlemen?" she asked firmly. Razor smirked, deliberately bumping into a chair as he approached the counter. "Yeah, sweetheart. One of our boys got himself banged up in a little accident. We're here to make sure he gets proper care, if you know what I mean." The implied threat in his voice was clear. Behind him, his gang members spread out across the waiting room, their heavy boots echoing against the floor. One of them, a hulking figure with tattooed arms, knocked over a stack of magazines, while another leaned uncomfortably close to Sarah Martinez, who refused to make eye contact. Hawk remained seated, but his body tensed as he observed the situation unfolding. He'd seen men like this before, bullies who mistook kindness for weakness. The other veterans in the room exchanged knowing glances, a silent communication born from years of military service. "Sir," Nancy replied steadily, "if your friend needs medical attention, he'll be seen according to our triage protocol. Everyone here waits their turn." Razor's smirk turned into a scowl. "Listen here, lady. Our buddy's been waiting out there for 20 minutes. He's going to be seen now, or things might get a little uncomfortable in here." The threat hung in the air like smoke. Mike Thompson gripped the armrest of his chair, his knuckles white. Sarah Martinez slowly reached for her phone. But before anyone could react, Hawk stood up, his movement drawing every eye in the room. "That's enough," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of command that had guided troops through countless missions. "This is a place of healing. Show some respect." The first part ended with Razor turning slowly to face Hawk. His gang members moving to flank him. The tension in the room crackled like electricity before a storm, as 2 forces prepared to collide in the most unexpected of places, a VA hospital waiting room on what had started as just another ordinary morning. Razor turned slowly to face Hawk, his face twisting into an amused sneer. "Well, well. What do we have here? Another old-timer trying to play hero? His gang members chuckled, their leather jackets creaking as they moved to surround their leader. The retired colonel didn't flinch. His calm demeanor, honed through decades of high-stakes military operations, remained unshaken. "I'm not playing anything," Hawk replied evenly. "I'm telling you how it's going to be." Nancy Chen watched the exchange with growing concern, her hand hovering near the security button under the desk. The other veterans in the waiting room had grown completely still, but their postures had changed, subtle shifts that only fellow service members would recognize as combat readiness. Razor took a step closer to Hawk, using his height to try to intimidate the older man. "You telling me what to do, old man? Because that wouldn't be very smart." His breath smelled of stale cigarettes as he leaned in, trying to provoke a reaction. "Smart would be following proper procedure," Hawk responded, not backing down an inch. "Your friend will be seen when it's his turn, just like everyone else here." His blue eyes remained locked on Razor's, unwavering. The largest member of the gang, a mountain of a man with tank tattooed across his knuckles, moved forward. "Boss, want me to show Grandpa here how we handle people who don't mind their own business?" Before Razor could respond, Mike Thompson wheeled himself forward, his prosthetic leg visible beneath his shorts. "The Colonel's business is our business," he said firmly. "We take care of our own here." Sarah Martinez stood up as well, her Navy training evident in her stance. Two other veterans, an elderly Vietnam-era Marine and a younger Army sergeant, moved to flank Hawk. The message was clear. The bikers weren't just facing one man, they were facing a unified front. Razor's expression darkened as he glanced around the room, seemingly realizing for the first time that he was surrounded by military veterans, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. "Look at this," he sneered. "The geriatric brigade thinks they can tell us what to do." "We're not telling you anything," Hawk replied calmly. "We're giving you a choice. Wait your turn respectfully or leave. Those are your options." Tank cracked his knuckles menacingly. "Or maybe we make our own option." He took a threatening step toward Mike Thompson, but before he could move further, the young Army sergeant stepped between them. "You really want to do this?" the sergeant asked quietly. "In a VA hospital? Think carefully about your next move." Nancy Chen's voice cut through the tension. "I've already called security," she announced firmly. "They're on their way, and the police have been notified." Razor hesitated, his bravado wavering slightly as he assessed the situation. His gang was outnumbered, and while they might be able to start something, they were beginning to realize they couldn't control how it would end. "This isn't over," Razor growled, but there was a note of uncertainty in his voice. He jerked his head toward the door, signaling his crew. "We'll be back, and next time we won't be so nice about it." As the gang retreated, their boots heavy on the linoleum floor, Hawk's voice followed them. "No, you won't be back. Some fights aren't worth picking. Remember that." The door swung shut behind the bikers, and the roar of their motorcycles filled the parking lot as they sped away. The waiting room remained silent for a moment, before Nancy Chen let out a relieved sigh. "Colonel Harrison, I don't know whether to thank you or scold you." Hawk turned to her with a slight smile. "Sometimes standing together is all it takes, Nancy. Most bullies back down when they realize they're not facing a single target." But as the veterans returned to their seats and the normal routine of the waiting room resumed, Hawk couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. He'd seen that look in Razor's eyes, the wounded pride that often led men like him to make foolish decisions. The morning's peace had been shattered, and everyone in the room knew that the real test was yet to come. The morning's confrontation sent ripples through the VA hospital community. Word spread quickly among the staff and regular patients about how Colonel Harrison and the other veterans had stood up to the devil's outcasts. By early afternoon, the waiting room had taken on the atmosphere of a quiet command center, with veterans strategically positioning themselves near entrances and keeping watchful eyes on the parking lot. Dr. Marcus Rivera, the hospital's chief of staff, called Hawk into his office to discuss the situation. The doctor's face was etched with concern as he leaned back in his chair. "Jim, I've known you for what, 15 years now? I understand why you did what you did, but these guys aren't your typical troublemakers." Hawk sat across from him, his posture relaxed but alert. "Tell me what you know about them, Marcus." The Devil's Outcasts have been causing problems up and down the coast. Started as a small group of troublemakers, but they've grown. They've got a reputation for coming back harder when they're challenged. Dr. Rivera drummed his fingers on his desk. "They don't like losing face." "Neither do we," Hawk replied quietly. "This is more than just a hospital, Marcus. You know that. For a lot of these vets, it's the one place they feel understood, respected. We can't let anyone take that away from them." A knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Nancy Chen entered, her face tense. "Dr. Colonel, you need to see this." She held up her tablet, showing a social media post from the Devil's Outcasts. The message was clear. They were planning to return that evening, and this time they were bringing reinforcements. "We should close early, Doctor," Rivera suggested. "Get everyone out before they show up." Hawk shook his head. "And what about tomorrow? Or next week? We close once, they'll know they can make us close anytime they want. This ends today." As they discussed options, Mike Thompson wheeled himself into the office, followed by Sarah Martinez and John Mac McPherson, the Vietnam-era Marine from earlier. "Sorry to interrupt," Mike said, "but we've got some news you need to hear." Sarah stepped forward. "I've been making calls. That injured buddy they mentioned? There isn't one. It was just an excuse to scope out the place. They've been pulling this same stunt at other facilities, causing trouble, intimidating staff and patients." Mac's weathered face hardened. "They pick places they think are soft targets. Places where people are vulnerable. They didn't expect to find a waiting room full of veterans." Hawk stood up, walking to the window that overlooked the parking lot. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the empty spaces where the bikers' motorcycles had been. "How many veterans do we typically have here in the evenings?" Nancy consulted her tablet. "Usually about 15 to 20, mostly for the evening PTSD group and physical therapy sessions." "And how many of them would stand with us if those bikers come back?" Hawk asked, though he already knew the answer. "All of them," Mike responded without hesitation. "Word's already spreading. Nobody wants to see this place turned into their playground." Dr. Rivera raised his hands in protest. "Wait a minute. You're not seriously suggesting we prepare for some kind of confrontation? These are patients, not soldiers anymore." "With all due respect, Doctor," Sarah interjected, "we're both. And sometimes being a good patient means protecting the place that helps you heal." Hawk turned from the window, his expression resolved. "We're not looking for a fight, Marcus, but we're not running either. Sometimes the only way to prevent violence is to show you're ready for it." The group spent the next hour developing a plan. Nancy coordinated with the evening staff, ensuring everyone knew what to do if trouble started. Security was quietly enhanced, with veterans volunteering to patrol the halls. The evening therapy groups would be consolidated into rooms farther from the main entrance. As the afternoon wore on, more veterans arrived early for their evening appointments, each one briefed on the situation, each one choosing to stay. The waiting room gradually filled with men and women who had served across different eras and branches, united now in a common purpose. Hawk watched them arrive one by one, young Marines fresh from recent conflicts, aging Vietnam veterans, retired Air Force pilots, Navy corpsmen. Each one nodded to him as they entered, taking up positions around the room with the casual precision of trained military personnel. "It's like old times," Mac said, standing beside him. "Different uniforms, same spirit." Hawk smiled slightly. "This is what they don't understand about veterans. We never really stop serving. We just find new ways to do it." As the sun began to set, casting orange light through the waiting room windows, the distant rumble of motorcycles could be heard growing closer. The veterans exchanged quiet glances, their resolve strengthening. The Devil's Outcasts were coming back, just as they'd promised. But this time, they'd find more than just a few old soldiers in their way. The rumble of motorcycles grew louder as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the VA hospital parking lot. Through the large windows, Hawk counted at least 15 bikes pulling in, 3 times the number from this morning. The Devil's Outcasts had indeed brought reinforcements, just as they'd promised. Inside the waiting room, 30 veterans maintained casual positions that belied their combat readiness. Mike Thompson had positioned his wheelchair near the front desk, appearing to chat with Nancy Chen while keeping a clear view of the entrance. Sarah Martinez sat reading a magazine, her trained eyes never leaving the door. Mac and several Vietnam-era veterans occupied the corners of the room, their decades of experience evident in their quiet vigilance. The automatic doors slid open, and Razor strode in, flanked by Tank and an even larger group of leather-clad bikers. Their boots echoed against the linoleum floor as they spread out across the waiting room. The evening shift security guard, a young man named Kevin, looked nervously between the bikers and the veterans. Well, Razor announced, his voice carrying across the quiet room. Looks like the senior center's having a reunion. His gang members chuckled, but there was an edge of uncertainty in their laughter as they noticed the number of veterans present. Hawk stepped forward, his movements unhurried. "You're making a mistake coming back here," he said calmly. "This isn't going to end the way you think it will." A new figure pushed through the gang members, a tall, scarred man with a patch identifying him as Viper. His presence seemed to embolden the others. "You the old-timer who thinks he runs this place?" Viper asked, his voice a gravelly drawl. "Nobody runs this place," Hawk replied evenly. "That's the point you seem to be missing. This is a hospital, not a battlefield. But if you want to treat it like one, remember, everyone in this room has seen real combat." Viper's eyes narrowed as he surveyed the room, taking in the quiet strength of the veterans who had positioned themselves strategically around the space. His gaze lingered on their bearing, their scars, their prosthetics, all testament to their service and sacrifice. "You think we're scared of a bunch of has-beens?" Tank growled, taking a threatening step forward. But Hawk noticed how some of the younger gang members were shifting uncomfortably, perhaps realizing they'd walked into something they hadn't anticipated. Dr. Rivera emerged from his office, his white coat a stark contrast to the tension-filled scene. "Gentlemen," he addressed the bikers, "I'm the chief of staff here. Whatever grievance you think you have, this isn't the way to handle it. These men and women served their country. They deserve respect, especially here." Viper sneered. "Respect has to be earned where we come from." "Earned?" Mac's voice cut through the room as he stood up, his aged frame straight with military bearing. "Son, everyone in this room earned their respect by putting their lives on the line for this country. What have you earned besides those cheap patches on your jacket?" The comment struck home. Several of the bikers shifted their weight, glancing at each other uncertainly. But Viper wasn't ready to back down. He moved closer to Mac, his hand curling into a fist. "You want to find out what I've earned, old man?" Before anyone could move, Sarah Martinez was suddenly between them, her voice steady and professional. "I work with trauma patients here. You really want to start something in a building full of combat veterans? Think about how that ends." The moment stretched like a wire about to snap. Hawk watched as Viper's eyes darted around the room, finally registering the reality of their situation. The Devil's Outcasts might have numbers, but they were facing men and women who had fought in jungles, deserts, and mountains across the world. People who had faced far worse than a gang of bikers trying to prove something. "This isn't worth it," one of the younger bikers muttered, loud enough for others to hear. "These ain't regular civilians, boss." Viper's jaw clenched as he felt control of the situation slipping away. Razor stepped forward, trying to salvage their reputation. "You think this is over?" he snarled at Hawk. "We can come back any time we want." "You could," Hawk agreed, his voice carrying across the now silent room. "But ask yourself this. If this is how we respond to your first 2 visits, what do you think happens on the 3rd? Or the 4th? How many times are you willing to test a room full of combat veterans?" The question hung in the air like smoke, and for the first time real doubt crept into Razor's expression. The Devil's Outcasts had built their reputation on intimidation, on people backing down. But here, in this VA hospital waiting room, they'd found something different, something they weren't prepared to handle. The tension in the waiting room was palpable as Viper and Razor exchanged glances, their earlier bravado cracking under the steady gazes of the veterans. Tank shifted his weight, his massive frame betraying his growing unease. The other gang members had begun to cluster closer together, unconsciously seeking safety in numbers. "Last chance," Hawk said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of command that had guided troops through countless missions. "Walk away now, and we'll call it a learning experience. Stay, and you'll learn a much harder lesson." Dr. Rivera moved to stand beside Hawk, his professional demeanor masking his tension. "I should mention that police units are already en route. They've been monitoring the situation since your first visit this morning. Your choice is simple. Leave now, or deal with law enforcement." Viper's face darkened with rage, but there was something else in his eyes now, a growing realization that they'd severely miscalculated. He looked around the room once more, taking in the unwavering stance of the veterans. Mike Thompson had wheeled himself closer, his prosthetic leg visible beneath his shorts, a testament to sacrifices made. Sarah Martinez stood ready, her medical training and military experience evident in her positioning. Mac and the other Vietnam veterans had formed a quiet line near the hallway, their weathered faces showing no fear. "You're bluffing," Razor spat, but his voice lacked conviction. "No cops would get here that fast." A slight smile crossed Hawk's face. "You really think we didn't prepare after your morning visit? This isn't our first rodeo, son. We've faced worse threats than you, in places a lot more dangerous than this." As if on cue, the distant wail of police sirens could be heard approaching. Several of the younger bikers began backing toward the door, their earlier enthusiasm for confrontation completely evaporated. "Boss," one of them muttered to Viper, "this ain't worth it. We got other territories." Viper's face contorted with fury and frustration. He took a half step toward Hawk, his fists clenched. "You think you've won? This isn't over, old man." "Actually it is," came a new voice. Everyone turned to see an elderly veteran in a wheelchair being pushed in by a nurse. His Korean War veteran cap sat proudly on his head. "You boys picked the wrong place to make your stand. This isn't just a hospital, it's sacred ground. Every person who walks through those doors has earned the right to be here through blood and sacrifice." The words seemed to hang in the air, carrying a weight that even the most hardened of the bikers couldn't ignore. The sirens were getting closer now, and the decision point had arrived. Viper looked at Hawk one last time, his expression a mix of anger and grudging respect. "Let's go," he growled to his crew. "This place ain't worth the trouble." The Devil's outcasts began filing out, their exit far less intimidating than their entrance had been. Tank paused at the door, looking back at the assembled veterans. For a moment, something like shame crossed his face before he followed his leaders out. The sound of motorcycles firing up filled the parking lot, and through the windows, they watched as the gang roared away into the growing darkness. The waiting room remained silent for a long moment before Nancy Chen let out a shaky breath. "Is it really over?" she asked, looking at Hawk. The retired colonel nodded slowly. "They might talk tough, but they're not stupid. They know when they're outmatched, they won't be back." Dr. Rivera ran a hand through his hair, relief evident on his face. "I've never seen anything quite like this," he admitted. "The way you all came together." "That's what veterans do," Mike Thompson said proudly. "We take care of our own." Sarah Martinez began checking on some of the older veterans, her medical training kicking in as the adrenaline subsided. Mac and his Vietnam-era compatriots shared knowing looks. They'd stood their ground once again, just like they had decades ago in another time and place. Hawk watched as the police cars pulled into the parking lot, their lights painting the walls in red and blue. The evening's excitement was far from over. There would be reports to file, statements to make, and precautions to plan. But the immediate threat had passed, and more importantly, the VA hospital had been protected. "You know," Mac said, coming to stand beside him, "those boys learned something important tonight. They learned that some places are sacred, and some bonds never break." Hawk nodded, watching as the veterans began to relax, sharing quiet laughs and pats on the back. In the face of threat, they had once again become a unit, defending not just a building, but the principles and respect it represented. The evening light faded outside, but inside the VA hospital waiting room, The spirit of service and solidarity burned as bright as ever. The following days at Veterans Memorial Hospital settled into an uneasy calm. The Devil's Outcasts hadn't returned, but their presence had left an indelible mark on the community. Security protocols had been enhanced, with more cameras installed and direct lines established to local law enforcement. Yet the most significant change was in the veterans themselves. The shared stand against intimidation had forged an even stronger bond among them. Hawk arrived earlier than usual for his Thursday morning appointment, noting the increased number of veterans who had started doing the same. Mike Thompson was already there, chatting with a young Marine who had recently returned from overseas. Sarah Martinez sat at her usual spot, but now she was teaching a group of elderly veterans some basic self-defense moves they could perform even with limited mobility. Nancy Chen approached Hawk with a cup of coffee, black, just the way he liked it. "The morning crew asked me to show you something," she said, pulling out her tablet. She opened a local news website showing surveillance footage of a Devil's Outcasts gathering at a bar 30 miles away. The gang appeared to be moving their operations further north, away from the hospital's vicinity. "Good," Hawk nodded, taking a sip of his coffee. "They learned their lesson." Dr. Rivera emerged from his office, looking more relaxed than he had in days. "Colonel, got a minute?" he asked, gesturing toward his office. Hawk followed him in, noting the new security monitor on the doctor's desk. "The board met yesterday," Rivera began, settling into his chair. "They wanted me to express their gratitude for how you and the others handled the situation. But they're also concerned about potential copycat incidents. Other troublemakers might see this as a challenge." Hawk leaned back in his chair, considering the doctor's words. "Then they'll learn the same lesson. This place isn't just a building, Marcus. It's a symbol of everything we fought for. Dignity, respect, the right to heal in peace." A knock at the door interrupted them. Mac entered, followed by two younger veterans Hawk hadn't seen before. "Sorry to interrupt, Doc," Mac said, "but these boys have something you both need to hear." The younger veterans introduced themselves as former Army Rangers. They'd been at a local diner the previous night and overheard some bikers talking. Not Devil's Outcasts, but another gang, the Steel Wolves. They were apparently interested in testing the VA hospital's defenses. "Seems our little stand against the outcasts has attracted attention," Mac explained, his weathered face grim. "These wannabe tough guys think they can succeed where Viper's crew failed." Dr. Rivera's face fell. "It's exactly what we feared. One incident leads to another." But Hawk saw something different in the situation. "No," he said firmly, standing up. "This is an opportunity. Word spreads fast in their circles. If we handle this right, we can send a message that will keep troublemakers away for good." The younger Rangers exchanged knowing looks. "We've got your back, sir," one of them said. "Just like you had the hospital's back." In the waiting room, the number of veterans had grown. News of potential new threats had spread through their informal network, bringing more of them in. Some came for appointments, others simply to be present, to show solidarity. The atmosphere wasn't one of fear or anxiety. Rather, it carried the familiar feeling of troops preparing for a mission. Sarah Martinez had organized a volunteer schedule, ensuring there were always enough veterans present during operating hours. Mike Thompson coordinated with local veteran motorcycle clubs. Not all bikers were troublemakers, and many were veterans themselves who wanted to help protect the hospital. Nancy Chen watched all this from her station, amazed at how quickly and efficiently the veteran community had mobilized. "It's like watching a military operation unfold," she commented to Hawk. "In a way, it is," he replied. "The mission's different, but the principles are the same. Protect what matters, stand together, never back down from what's right." The morning sun climbed higher, casting long shadows through the waiting room windows. Hawk observed the veterans going about their business, some heading to appointments, others arriving to volunteer, all of them part of something bigger than themselves. The threat they had faced had transformed into something unexpected, a renewal of the bonds of service that had defined their military years. Dr. Rivera joined him by the window. "You know," the doctor said quietly, "when I first started working here, I thought I was just treating patients. But over the years, I've learned that this place is more than a hospital. It's a community, a sanctuary. Hawk nodded, watching as Mac taught some younger veterans the finer points of situational awareness. That's why we'll always protect it, he said. Not just from gangs or troublemakers, but from anything that threatens what it stands for. The message was clear. The VA hospital wasn't just prepared for potential threats. It had been strengthened by them. Any group thinking of following in the Devil's Outcast's footsteps would face not just a building full of veterans, but a unified community ready to stand its ground. The Steel Wolves didn't wait long to make their move. Just 3 days after the Rangers' warning, the low rumble of approaching motorcycles filled the afternoon air. Through the waiting room windows, Hawk counted 20 bikes pulling into the parking lot, their chrome gleaming in the sunlight, their riders dressed in black leather vests emblazoned with snarling wolf emblems. This gang had clearly done their homework. Instead of charging in like the outcasts, they positioned themselves strategically around the entrance. Their leader, a tall man with a silver-streaked beard who went by Alpha, dismounted first, surveying the building with calculating eyes. Inside, the veterans maintained their routines, though everyone was acutely aware of the situation. Mike Thompson had positioned himself near the front desk, appearing to chat with Nancy Chen while keeping watch. Sarah Martinez continued her physical therapy session with an elderly veteran, but her stance was ready. Mac and several other Vietnam-era veterans sat reading magazines, their relaxed postures belying their combat readiness. The automatic doors slid open, and Alpha entered, flanked by 4 of his lieutenants. Unlike Razor and Viper, he moved with a controlled precision that caught Hawk's attention. This man had military training. You could see it in his movement patterns and situational awareness. "Afternoon," Alpha said, his voice carrying across the room. "Hope we're not interrupting anything." His eyes scanned the room, noting exits, camera positions, and the distribution of people, definitely ex-military. Hawk stepped forward, studying the man. "Former Marine?" he asked quietly. A flicker of surprise crossed Alpha's face. "Force Recon, 95 to 03. You've got a good eye, Colonel." "Then you know exactly what you're walking into," Hawk replied, his voice level. "The question is, why? You're not just some random troublemaker. You understand what this place means." Alpha's expression hardened. "Times change, Colonel. War taught me that the only people you can count on are the ones in your immediate circle. Everyone else is just talk." The other veterans in the room had grown still, listening to the exchange. This was different from the outcasts, more personal, more complex. This wasn't just about territory or intimidation. This was about a veteran who'd lost his way. "You're wrong," Mike Thompson spoke up, wheeling himself forward. "Look around this room. Every person here has fought their own battles, not just in war, but in coming home. We stand together because that's how we survive." Alpha's gang members shifted uncomfortably. They'd expected another confrontation like the one they'd heard about with the outcasts, not this quiet tension between fellow veterans. "Pretty words," Alpha sneered, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of uncertainty. "But when push comes to shove, where were all these brothers in arms when I was sleeping under bridges? Where were they when I was fighting the VA for basic care?" "Right here," Sarah Martinez said firmly, stepping forward. "Every day, helping each other navigate the system, sharing resources, providing support. The question is, where were you? Because this door has always been open." Max stood up slowly, his voice gravelly but clear. "Son, I spent 10 years after Nam thinking I had to handle everything alone. Nearly destroyed myself before I learned that the strength of a soldier isn't in standing alone. It's in standing together." The tension in the room shifted. This wasn't building toward a fight. It was moving toward something else. A confrontation of ideals, of different paths taken after wearing the same uniform. "You didn't come here to start trouble," Hawk said quietly. "You came to prove something. But look around, really look. This is what you've been missing. This is what you walked away from." Alpha's jaw tightened, his eyes scanning the room again. This time he saw beyond tactical positions. He saw the Korean War veteran helping a young Iraq War amputee with his wheelchair. He saw the Vietnam vet sharing coping techniques with a Gulf War survivor. He saw the community he'd convinced himself didn't exist. "Boss," one of his lieutenants muttered, "this isn't what we signed up for." The Steel Wolves' leader stood silent for a long moment, the conflict clear on his face. Finally, he spoke, his voice rougher than before. "You've made your point, Colonel, but don't think this means we're backing down out of fear." "I know exactly why you're backing down," Hawk replied. "Because somewhere under that vest you're still a Marine, and Marines don't dishonor what this place stands for." Alpha held Hawk's gaze for a moment longer, then gave a sharp nod. Without another word, he turned and walked out, his crew following behind him. Through the windows, they watched as the Steel Wolves mounted their bikes and rode away, their departure marked by dignity rather than defeat. The waiting room remained quiet for a long moment before Dr. Rivera emerged from his office. "That was different," he said, looking at Hawk with questioning eyes. "Sometimes the hardest battles are fought with words," Hawk replied, "and the most important victories aren't about who's stronger, but who remembers who they really are." The encounter with the Steel Wolves had a profound effect on the VA hospital community, but in ways no one had expected. Word spread quickly through veteran circles about how a potential confrontation had transformed into something deeper, a reminder of the bonds that connected all who had served, regardless of their current path. A week after the incident, Hawk arrived for his regular appointment to find an unexpected visitor waiting in Dr. Rivera's office. Alpha sat there, without his gang colors, dressed in civilian clothes. His face was drawn with fatigue and something else, the look of a man wrestling with long-buried truths. "He came in this morning, Doctor," Rivera explained quietly. "Asked about PTSD counseling and support groups." Hawk nodded, understanding the significance of the moment. "Sometimes it takes seeing your reflection in others to recognize what you've become," he said. Alpha stood as Hawk entered, his military bearing unconsciously reasserting itself. "Colonel," he acknowledged, his voice rougher than before. "I owe you and this place an apology." "No," Hawk replied. "You owe yourself one. The man who led the Steel Wolves wasn't the Marine who served his country. You just needed to remember that." The conversation that followed was quiet but intense. Alpha spoke about his struggles after leaving the service, the anger that had led him to join the Steel Wolves, and the moment in the waiting room when he'd recognized what he'd almost destroyed. "The Wolves are disbanding," Alpha revealed. "At least my chapter is. Turns out I wasn't the only veteran in the group who needed a wake-up call." Throughout the day, more veterans filtered into the hospital, some for appointments, others simply to be present. The atmosphere had shifted. There was still vigilance, but it was tempered now with a deeper understanding of why their presence mattered. Sarah Martinez had started a new support group specifically for veterans struggling with reintegration. Mike Thompson volunteered to speak at local veteran outreach programs, sharing his story of finding community at the VA. Mac and his Vietnam-era compatriots became informal mentors, their experiences bridging generations of service. Nancy Chen noticed the changes in her daily rounds. "It's different now," she commented to Hawk. "Before, we were just treating patients. Now it feels like we're rebuilding lives." Dr. Rivera called a staff meeting to discuss the transformation they were witnessing. "What happened with the Steel Wolves taught us something important," he said. "Sometimes the biggest threats to our veterans aren't physical. They're the invisible wounds of isolation and lost purpose." Hawk watched from his usual spot by the window as a group of younger veterans helped an elderly Korean War veteran from his car. Among them was one of Alpha's former lieutenants, now wearing a volunteer badge instead of gang colors. "You know what the real victory was?" Mac said, joining him at the window. "It wasn't standing our ground against the outcasts or turning the wolves around. It was showing that this place is more than just a hospital. It's a way back home." The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the parking lot, but the waiting room remained full. Veterans who had once hurried through their appointments now lingered, engaging with others, sharing stories, offering support. The threat of gang intimidation had inadvertently strengthened the very community it had meant to frighten. A young Marine recently returned from overseas approached Hawk hesitantly. "Sir," he said, I heard about what happened with the gangs. But what I've seen here this past week, it's given me hope. I've been struggling since coming back, feeling lost. But seeing all this..." He gestured around the room. "This is what we fought for," Hawk finished quietly. "Not just the battles overseas, but the daily battles here at home. Standing together, helping each other heal, remembering who we are." Dr. Rivera joined them, watching the interaction between veterans of different eras, different conflicts, all united in this space. "When I first became chief of staff," he said, "I thought my job was to run a medical facility. Now I realize we're custodians of something much more precious." The day wound down, but the waiting room remained active with conversation and connection. The fear that had initially brought them together had transformed into something stronger, a renewed sense of purpose and belonging. As Hawk prepared to leave for the day, he paused at the entrance, looking back at the scene. The waiting room had become more than just a place to wait for appointments. It had become a testament to the enduring spirit of service that connected all veterans, even those who had temporarily lost their way. "You know," Nancy Chen said, joining him at the door, "I used to worry about what might happen here. Now I worry about what might happen to some veterans if this place didn't exist." Hawk nodded, understanding completely. The VA hospital had proven itself to be more than just a building. It was a beacon, calling veterans back to the principles and brotherhood that had defined their service, reminding them that no matter how far they might stray, there was always a way back home. 2 weeks after the Steel Wolves incident, the VA hospital's transformation continued to ripple through the veteran community. What had started as a response to threats had evolved into something extraordinary, a revitalization of the veteran support system itself. Early one morning, Hawk arrived to find an unusual sight. Alpha, now a regular at PTSD counseling sessions, was helping a group of former Steel Wolves members unload boxes from their bikes. Inside were supplies for the hospital's outreach program, everything from toiletries to warm clothing for homeless veterans. "Found these guys living under the 5th Street Bridge," Alpha explained, nodding toward 2 weathered veterans watching nervously from the entrance. "Figured they needed to know about this place." Nancy Chen was already preparing paperwork to help the newcomers navigate the system. Sarah Martinez had stepped in to conduct initial health assessments, while Mike Thompson shared his own story of recovery with them. "Sometimes the hardest step is just walking through those doors," Mike told them, his prosthetic leg a testament to his own journey. "But you're not alone anymore." Dr. Rivera watched the scene unfold from his office doorway, shaking his head in amazement. "You know, Colonel," he said as Hawk approached, "when I filed those incident reports about the gang confrontations, I never imagined this would be the outcome." The waiting room had become a hub of activity. Veterans of all ages and eras moved through the space with purpose. Some came for appointments, others to volunteer, or simply to be part of the community. The stark fluorescent lighting seemed softer now, warmed by the spirit of camaraderie that filled the room. Mac had organized a mentor program, pairing older veterans with younger ones struggling to adjust to civilian life. "It's like watching the service branches come together during joint operations," he commented to Hawk. "Different experiences, same mission." Even the hospital staff had noticed the change. The security guard, Kevin, no longer watched the entrance with nervous anticipation. Instead, he greeted veterans by name, part of the extended family that the facility had become. "Remember how quiet it used to be?" Nancy asked as she sorted through patient files. "Now I have to remind people we actually close at some point." The afternoon brought a surprise visit from local law enforcement. The police captain, himself a former Army Ranger, had come to discuss the hospital's transformation. "Word's spreading," he explained in Dr. Rivera's office. "Other VA facilities are asking how you did it, how you turned a security threat into a community revival." Hawk listened as Dr. Rivera explained the series of events, noting how the narrative had shifted from one of confrontation to one of redemption and renewal. "It wasn't about fighting back," Hawk interjected quietly. "It was about standing together, reminding everyone, even those who'd lost their way, what it means to serve." Sarah Martinez joined the discussion, adding her perspective on the healthcare implications. We're seeing better attendance at therapy sessions, more engagement in treatment programs. Veterans who used to rush through appointments now stay, talk, connect. Outside the office, the daily rhythm of the hospital continued. A young Marine who'd recently returned from overseas was showing an elderly Vietnam veteran how to use the new patient check-in system. Former Steel Wolves members, their gang insignias replaced with volunteer badges, helped a wheelchair-bound veteran navigate the hallway. "You know what impresses me most?" Mike Thompson said, wheeling up to where Hawk stood observing the scene. "It's not just about receiving help anymore. Everyone's finding ways to give back." He was right. The transformation went beyond security or healthcare. The VA hospital had become a living example of the military values that had shaped them all: honor, duty, and the unwavering commitment to leave no one behind. As the day progressed, Alpha approached Hawk with news. "3 more chapters of the Wolves are disbanding," he said. "Turns out a lot of us were just looking for the brotherhood we lost after service. We just looked for it in the wrong places." The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, casting long shadows across the waiting room floor. Dr. Rivera stood at his office door, watching as veterans of different eras shared stories, offered support, and demonstrated the timeless bonds of service. "You know what we really did here?" he asked Hawk. "We didn't just protect a building, we reclaimed its soul." Hawk nodded, understanding completely. The VA hospital had become more than a medical facility. It was a bridge between the person each veteran had been in service and the person they could be in civilian life. As the day wound down, Nancy Chen prepared to hand over to the evening shift. "It's like the end of the story isn't really the end," she mused. "It's just the beginning of something bigger." She was right. What had started as a stand against intimidation had evolved into a movement of renewal and hope. The true victory wasn't in defeating those who threatened the hospital. It was in helping them remember who they were meant to be. A month had passed since the initial confrontation with the Devil's Outcasts, and the change at Veterans Memorial Hospital was nothing short of remarkable. The waiting room, once a place of quiet anxiety, had transformed into a vibrant hub of veteran support and community. On this particular morning, Hawk arrived to find something unexpected: a familiar motorcycle parked in the lot. It belonged to Razor, the former Devil's Outcasts leader. But unlike his previous visits, he was alone, without his gang colors, sitting quietly in the waiting room with slumped shoulders. Nancy Chen approached Hawk as he entered, her voice low. "He's been here for an hour. Won't talk to anyone except to ask for you." Hawk nodded, making his way to where Razor sat. The former gang leader looked up, his tough exterior cracking. "Didn't know where else to go," he admitted. "Heard about what happened with Alpha and the Wolves, about how this place helps." "That's what it's here for," Hawk replied, sitting down beside him. "No matter how far we stray, there's always a way back." Throughout the day, veterans of all eras filtered through the doors. Mike Thompson was conducting a peer support session in one corner, sharing strategies for adapting to prosthetics. Sarah Martinez had organized a job fair specifically for veterans, with employers who understood their unique challenges and strengths. Dr. Rivera emerged from his office, pausing to observe the scene. "You know what strikes me most?" he said to Hawk. "A month ago, we were worried about protecting this place. Now it's protecting others." The evidence was everywhere. Former gang members, including some of the Devil's Outcasts and Steel Wolves, had become regular volunteers. They helped with everything from wheelchair assistance to navigating the complex VA benefit system. Their knowledge of the streets proved invaluable in reaching homeless veterans who were hesitant to seek help. Mac, working with Alpha, had established a network of veteran mentors who could respond at any hour to help others in crisis. "Sometimes the difference between giving up and holding on is knowing someone understands," he explained to a group of new volunteers. The afternoon brought a special ceremony. The hospital board had decided to formally recognize the veterans who had stood together during the gang confrontations. But true to their nature, the veterans had turned it into something else, a celebration of community and renewal. "We're not here to commemorate a confrontation," Hawk said when asked to speak. We're here to celebrate what happens when veterans remember their true strength, not in standing against something, but in standing for each other. As he spoke, he noticed Razor listening intently from the back of the room. The former gang leader's eyes were fixed on the interactions around him, the easy camaraderie, the mutual support, the sense of purpose that had eluded him for so long. Nancy Chen had started a wall of photographs near the entrance, images of veterans helping veterans, of transformations and reunions, of hope restored. Sometimes people need to see it to believe it, she explained, to know that change is possible. The impact extended beyond the hospital walls. Other VA facilities had begun implementing similar community building programs. The local police reported a significant drop in veteran-related incidents. More importantly, veterans who had once felt lost and alone were finding their way back to the brotherhood they had known in service. As the day drew to a close, Hawk found himself in Dr. Rivera's office, discussing the changes they'd witnessed. "You know what the real miracle is?" Rivera asked. "It's not just that we stopped the gangs. It's that we helped them remember who they really were." Outside, the setting sun cast long shadows across the parking lot. Razor was helping an elderly veteran to his car, his movements careful and respectful. Alpha was conducting a peer support session for former gang members struggling to rebuild their lives. The waiting room remained active with conversation and connection. "A month ago, we thought we were defending a building," Mike Thompson commented, wheeling up beside Hawk. "Turns out we were really rebuilding a community." Sarah Martinez joined them, adding, "And the best part? It keeps growing. Every person who finds their way back helps light the path for someone else." As Hawk prepared to leave for the day, he paused at the entrance, taking in the scene one last time. The VA hospital had become more than a medical facility. It was a beacon of hope, a testament to the enduring spirit of service that connected all veterans. Razor approached him before he left, his voice gruff with emotion. "You know, when we first came here, we thought we were so tough. But real strength? It's what I'm seeing here. It's what I want to be part of." Hawk nodded, understanding completely. The true victory wasn't in standing against the gangs. It was in helping them find their way back to the values and brotherhood they had once known. The hospital had become a bridge, not just between illness and health, but between lost and found, between who they had been and who they could be again. As he walked to his car, Hawk reflected on how a moment of confrontation had led to a movement of transformation. The VA hospital stood as a reminder that sometimes the greatest battles aren't won with fists or force, but with understanding, unity, and the unwavering belief in each other's potential for change. The story of Veterans Memorial Hospital's transformation spread far beyond Portland. 6 months after the initial confrontation with the Devil's Outcasts, the facility had become a model for veteran community building across the country. Other VA hospitals sent representatives to learn how a potential crisis had become a catalyst for positive change. On this crisp autumn morning, Hawk arrived to find camera crews setting up in the parking lot. A national news program had come to document what they called the Portland V a Miracle. But the real story wasn't in the headlines or sound bites. It was in the quiet moments of transformation that continued to unfold daily. Inside, the waiting room buzzed with its new normal. Alpha was leading a morning briefing for the volunteer security team, which now included former members of both the Devil's Outcasts and Steel Wolves. Their leather jackets, once emblazoned with gang insignias, now bore patches reading, "Veterans Helping Veterans." "You were right," Alpha said to Hawk as the briefing concluded. "The brotherhood we were looking for in the gangs, it was here all along. We just had to remember who we really were." Razor, who had become one of the hospital's most dedicated volunteers, was helping a newly arrived veteran navigate the benefit system. His street-tough exterior remained, but his eyes had softened, finding purpose in service once again. Dr. Rivera emerged from his office, shaking his head in amazement at the scene. "You know what the board said in their last meeting? Our patient compliance rates are up 70%. Veterans who used to skip appointments now show up early, stay late, help others. It's like the whole culture has shifted." Nancy Chen had expanded her role, coordinating a network of veteran support services that extended far beyond the hospital walls. "Remember when we were worried about protecting this place?" she asked, organizing files at her desk. "Now we're watching it protect others." The afternoon brought a special gathering. Veterans from across the state had come to share their experiences of community building and rehabilitation. Mike Thompson, speaking from his wheelchair, addressed the crowd with passionate conviction. 6 months ago, we thought we were facing a threat, he said. Instead, we were being given an opportunity to show what happens when veterans remember their true strength isn't in standing alone, but in standing together. Sarah Martinez had developed a comprehensive peer support program that was being adopted by VA facilities nationwide. The key was realizing that every veteran, even those who seemed lost to gangs or despair, carried within them the same values that had made them serve in the first place, she explained to a group of visiting administrators. Mac, now heading the mentor program, worked closely with local law enforcement to identify and reach out to veterans in crisis. "We're not just preventing problems," he told Hawk. "We're rebuilding lives, one veteran at a time." The news crews captured the surface story: the reformed gang members, the improved services, the innovative programs. But they couldn't quite capture the deeper transformation that had occurred. It was in the way veterans greeted each other, in the quiet conversations in corners, in the moments of understanding that passed between those who had walked similar paths. As the day progressed, Hawk found himself reflecting on how far they'd come. The confrontation that had started it all seemed like a lifetime ago. The VA hospital had become more than a medical facility. It was a living testament to the enduring power of military values and brotherhood. "You know what's remarkable?" Dr. Rivera said, joining him by the window. "We're not just treating symptoms anymore. We're healing the invisible wounds, the loss of purpose, the disconnection, the struggle to belong in civilian life." Outside, the autumn sun cast long shadows across the parking lot, where the devil's outcasts had once tried to assert their dominance. Now that same space was filled with veterans helping veterans, former adversaries working together, a community united in purpose. A young Marine recently returned from overseas approached Hawk. "Sir," he said, "I heard the story about what happened here. But seeing it, it's different. It's like finding a piece of what we had in service, but here at home." Hawk nodded, understanding completely. "That's because the core values never really left us," he replied. "Sometimes we just need reminding of who we are." As the news crews packed up their equipment and the day wound down, the real story continued. Veterans lingered in the waiting room, sharing stories and support. Former gang members worked alongside career medical staff, each contributing to the mission of healing and hope. Nancy Chen, preparing to end her shift, summed it up best. "We didn't just stop a gang," she said. "We started a movement. And the best part? It keeps growing, keeps reaching more veterans who need to find their way back home." The sun set on another day at Veterans Memorial Hospital, but the light of transformation continued to shine. What had begun as a stand against intimidation had become a beacon of hope, a reminder that the strongest battles are won not through force, but through understanding, unity, and the unwavering belief in each other's capacity for change. A year had passed since the first confrontation at Veterans Memorial Hospital. The cold morning air carried the distant rumble of motorcycles, but this time, they belonged to the Veterans Support Riders, a group formed from former gang members who now escorted vulnerable veterans to their appointments. Hawk watched from his usual spot as Alpha and Razor led the morning convoy, their bikes now bearing American flags instead of gang insignias. The transformation that had begun with a stand against intimidation had rippled across the country, with similar programs starting at VA hospitals nationwide. Dr. Rivera joined him, holding the latest statistics report. "Our success rate has become a national model," he said. "Other facilities are implementing what they're calling the Portland Protocol, but they can't quite replicate what makes this place special." "Because it's not about protocols," Hawk replied. "It's about remembering who we are." The waiting room had evolved into a community center. Veterans from different eras mingled freely, sharing experiences and support. Mike Thompson now headed a national advocacy program for disabled veterans. Sarah Martinez had expanded her outreach to include family support services. Mac, despite his advancing years, remained a cornerstone of the mentor program. "You know what makes this work?" he asked a group of new volunteers. We stopped seeing ourselves as patients and started remembering we're still soldiers, just fighting different battles now. Nancy Chen had been promoted to Director of Veteran Services, overseeing programs that extended far beyond medical care. "Remember when we were afraid to leave the front desk unattended?" she reminisced. "Now we can't find enough space for all the volunteers." The afternoon brought a special ceremony. The hospital was dedicating its new community center, built with funds raised by former gang members who had found their way back to service. That's the end of the story. More interesting story already appear on the screen. Listen one of them to understand how justice is being served.